This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, good morning, Rabbi. So we have a special shiur this morning. I just want to warn you before, please put on your expedition gear because we're going on a special adventure. If you like a boring life, like to sit back and rest on your couch, lean back and sip a cup of tea, this shiur is not for you. For this shiur, you have to have a sense of adventure. You have to be willing to get a little risky and go out there, and you have to get your scuba gear ready because we're going down to the depths of the sea on a special mission to try to understand and discover a detail of a mitzvah that what we'd like to investigate is to see, do we still have access to this detail, or has it been lost from us? Ba'avanoseinu harabim. Parshas Shelach. And Be'ezus Hashem, if this goes well, we're going to be doing this for many weeks. Okay, this is a very substantial topic, and really, to me, one of the most interesting topics. And it's a narrative and it's a story, but along the way, we're going to hopefully, Be'ezus Hashem, gain a lot of Yediyas HaTorah. Okay, the pasuk says, Daber o b'nei Yisrael, speak to the Jewish people, v'yamarta aleihem, you should say to them, v'yasu lahem tzitzis al kanfei v'gdeihem l'daraisam, they should make for themselves tzitzis on the corners of their garments for all generations, v'nasnu al tzitzis hakanaf, and they should put on the corner of the tzitzis pesil techeles, a strand of techeles. So, of course, we know there are two details of the mitzvah of tzitzis. There's a lavan, and there is the techeles. Most people today, if you look at their tzitzis, it looks all white. Yet we know there certainly was a time when part of the mitzvah of tzitzis was to dye one of the strings the color of techeles. Well, what happened to it? Do we still have it? If we don't, why don't we have it? If we don't have it, when did it stop? When did it go lost? The Mishnayos talk about it. The Gemaras seem to talk about it. At what point in time did it go lost? Why did it go lost? And can we retrieve it? And if we can retrieve it, are we obligated to retrieve it? And if we're obligated to retrieve it, is it humanly possible to bring it back? Now, certainly, our Golus has been a very long and difficult one. And not in all generations has it even been possible to have the wherewithal and have the mental focus and the ability. Some would say, if you have time to be looking for Techeles, you've got a lot of time on your hands. But sometimes in history, we haven't had so much time on our hands, or resources on our hands, and other times we've had. Probably the father of the movement, the revolution to try to restore and bring back Techeles was none other than the great Radziner Rebbe, Rav Gershon Chanoich of Radzin, the great Radziner Rebbe. Now the Radziner Rebbe was no ordinary Rebbe. If he was here today, would he be a Rebbe? It would be difficult to imagine someone of that personality being a Rebbe today. Why do I say that? He was not your typical Rebbe. He was a brilliant scholar in all disciplines. Besides knowing Kol HaTorah Kula, every mitzvah in Torah, as we're going to see very soon, he was a brilliant scholar in science, in mathematics, in all sciences, in biology, in chemistry, in physics. He spoke many, many languages. He was a world traveler and a very colorful personality. But aside and above that, he was one of the greatest all-time Talmidei Chachamim. He was an individual who he realized, we have no Yushalmi on Taras. We have Yushalmi on other starim. We have no Yushalmi on Taras. So the Radziner Rebbe actually went ahead and wrote a Yushalmi on Taras, following the pattern and the language and the dialect and the way Yushalmi is written. He wrote. Can you imagine? 1,500 years later, he wrote a Yushalmi on Taras. You say Yushalmi on Taras, but you need Mefarshim. So he wrote on the right-hand column what would have been a Rashi. The way Rashi writes, every time he felt Rashi would have commented, he wrote what he thought Rashi would have said in the way Rashi would have said it. What about Tosfos? He wrote a Tosfos. He wrote every kasha that he thought Tosfos would have asked, an answer that he thought Tosfos would have answered, to the point where Talmidei Chachamim started to ask, well, wait a second, was the Yushalmi found on Taras? People didn't realize there was no Yerushalmi on Taros. And this created a controversy. Comes Rabbi Tzala Kohen of Vilna, together with the Baal Oineg Yomtiv and the Bezin of Vilna, and they put this Yerushalmi in Cherem. Why? Because it was too good. It was too exact. It was such a good replica. They felt that even a brilliant Talmid Chacham would never be able to distinguish between the real Yerushalmi and this new Yerushalmi. And they said this is not correct.
How did he bring up to Noam and Amaron?
He didn't, but he brought ideas. He brought, Shakla Vataria about on the Mishnah. And he brought in, basically, you want to have Rotav Nam? Because he brought in every Gemara and Shas, every Medrash, every Mechilta, every Sifra Sifri that spoke about Taros, and he incorporated it into as if it would be a Gemara. Who came to the defense of the Radziner Rebbe? None other than the Malbim. The Malbim said, you can't excommunicate a work because it's too good, because it's too precise, because it's too much like the Yerushalmi. Who else came to the defense of the Radziner Rebbe? Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan, the Paisek Hadar, Rabbi Yeshua Mikutna, the Stei Chemed. They all defended the work of the Yerushalmi of the Radziner Rebbe. They defended it, and we have it ad hayom. So this is who we're talking about. We're not talking about a regular personality. We're not talking about your what? Sidrei Taras? I'm not sure. We're not talking about your run-of-the-mill Talmid Chacham here. We're talking about a cut above. We're talking about somebody whose knowledge of Torah is ein l'shayar. And therefore, in the year 1887, in the aftermath of his publishing of this Yerushalmi, he said, you know what? There are other things that we don't have anymore. And one of the things that he writes in utter dismay of his disappointment that we no longer have is we don't have Techeles anymore. So in 1887, he penned his first work on Techeles. This is actually a set called Sifrei HaTcheles of all the Svarim of the Radziner Rebbe on this subject. And in 1887, the Radziner Rebbe lived from 1839 to 1891. And I don't know how this happened. And I tell you, you could confirm the story. Last night, at 11 o'clock at night, I got a call, random call, from the great-grandson of the Radziner Rebbe. I got an email earlier in the day that from a great-grandson of Radziner Rebbe, he knew that I have shiurim on this subject. And I called him out. I said, actually, I plan on giving the shiur tomorrow. So maybe you could give me some information. So I'll tell you one story that he told me. Last night. Want to know what time? This was after 11 o'clock at night. Okay? After... I can't, what's his name? Yavitz. His name is Yavitz. Well, Yavitz stands for Yaakov Ben Tzvi. Whose name was Yavitz? Rav Yaakov Emden. He's 9th generation Ben Achar Ben from Rav Yaakov Emden. He has the original Siddur of Rav Yaakov Emden with Rav Yaakov Emden's handwriting in it. So he called me. I'll tell you what time this conversation was. He lives in Flatbush. You ever hear of that country? 10:55. But I'm not going to give you... What? Flatbush. Flatbush. So he told me, the Radziner Rebbe's daughter married Rav Yavitz, who was later on a Rav in the Agud of 18th Avenue. And he, as a wedding and as an engagement gift, he sent to the future son-in-law a pekel of Techeles. Now, how did he, there's no UPS back then, so he sent it through, the dirt roads, the mud roads of Poland to the future son-in-law. And the future son-in-law said to the guy, what is this? It's Techeles from the Shver. He said, do me a favor, send it back to the Shver and say, Unzera, we don't do this. We don't do this. Okay, that's the story. Okay, but in 1887, the Radziner Rebbe, and the aftermath of publishing his commentary on the Yerushalmi, writes, Bavnosenu harabim, we no longer have Techeles, and among many of the things that we no longer have. And the fact that we don't have Techeles is really a great detraction and deficiency in our Avodas Hashem. As we know, the Gemara says in Menachos, Mem Gimel Amud Beis, that if you have the following three things, it's a very potent protection that a person not sin. The Gemara says anyone who wears tefillin on their head, tefillin on their arms, tzitzis on their beged, mezuzah on the door, it's bechizuk shelo yechta. So the fact that we don't have tzitzis b'miluai is a major deficiency in our protection from HaKadosh Baruch from Chet. More than that, the Gemara says over there, Menachos Mem Daled, many stories of people who are about to commit the unspeakable, and at the last moment, they get whacked in their face with the tzitzis. And it wasn't the white tzitzis that whacked them in the face. The white, you could try it. You do that, it's not always going to stop you. It's the blue. The blue is what protects you from doing an Aveira. As the Gemara says, Techeles is doime liyam. Yam is doime l'rakia. Rakia is doime kisei hakavod. So it reminds you that the lavan is not doime liyam. It's the Techeles. And therefore, Bab Noseino Rabbim, that we don't have Techeles. And it shouldn't be a surprise that we don't have Techeles, because there are many things that we don't have. The Gemara in Yuma says we don't have an Arayin, we don't have the Eish Min HaShamayim, we don't have Urim V'Tumim, we don't have Shechina, we don't have Ruach HaKodesh. But nevertheless, look at what the Radziner Rebbe writes in number 2, in the bold print, in the second paragraph. Achein vadai roi v'nochain b'chol dar v'dar. It is fit and proper in every generation. L'chomi asher yiras Hashem naga b'libai. To anyone who the fear of God strikes his heart. Don't just say, oh, the Torah says, psil Techeles, and I go on with my merry way. I come to Agra the Pirka, I'll chop a coffee here, I'll go home and I eat tuna fish, and v'zehu. No! The Torah says Techeles! So if you have some fear of God in your heart, you need to make it your business to do whatever you can to try to find Techeles. You can't just rest on your laurels. They didn't change it to rest on your yani yet, right? Rest on your laurels, right? Lizboinein velosum lev lechapes al makom sheyadem agas. And a person has to investigate and search up to where his hand reaches. Ula yizakeo Hashem liyos mimizake harabim. You never know. If you go into the deep seas and you find the Techeles, maybe you'll be the guy who is Mazaka Klal Yisrael in this great mitzvah, lahachzir avoidas ateras teferes haTcheles liYisrael. Now, so you'll say, well, wait a second. We know, im rishonim k'malachim anu k'bnei adam. Rishonim k'bnei adam k'malachim. No, we know that us compared to the earlier generations, we're nothing. So if they didn't look for Techeles, and they didn't search for Techeles, and they were sort of rested on their laurels, so why are we obligated to search for it? Why should we do what the earlier generations didn't do? Well, says Radziner Rebbe, that's why I wrote this book, to explain that it is our absolute obligation to do whatever we can to try to find the Techeles. So the Radziner Rebbe sort of stirred up the world to try to clarify what are the signs of Techeles, and he spoke to many Gedolim, and he even wrote a letter to Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan. Should we look for it? I think I have it, because basically he narrowed it down to a species of fish, which he writes in the third, in the Sefer Sefune Tmunei Chayil on page Lamed Aleph, the third Maramakam on your sheet, left-hand side in the fourth line. He says, I've began the mission. So Rabbi said, the Radziner Rebbe is at it, we're after him, get your, flippers on. V'shalachti l'glilos Yam HaTichon, I sent to the district of the Yam HaTichon. What's the Yam HaTichon? The Mediterranean. And they sent me a creature, which is one of the species called Degei Hadiyai, right? The ink fish, or in German, the tint fish, or in English, the cuttlefish. And how many species of them are there? There are 19 different species. And I am sure, says the Radziner Rebbe, of these 19 species, one of them's got to be the chilazain. One of them's got to be, because I found that it has all the simanim that Chazal delineate, and it has black ink. I even have it. But the problem is, I hired chemists. Nobody was able to extract a blue color out of this black ink. But the problem is, the reason why they couldn't extract the blue color from the black ink is because I couldn't get my hands on it alive. You see, back then, if you got a delivery at your doorstep in Poland from some fish that came from the Mediterranean, Rabbi say, that fish was not coming to your door alive. They're not bringing in a fish tank. So one day, the Radziner Rebbe hears a thump at his door, and he probably, caught a whiff of something at his door, and he opens it up, and there's a dead cuttlefish there. And he brought it to all the chemists, the Polish chemists, the best chemists in the world are the Polish chemists, and they still could not get a blue color out of the black dye. But he said, if I ever get my hands on a living cuttlefish, I'm going to get out the blue color. And I pray to God, please God, give me the merit to go down to the Mediterranean Sea and get my hands on a living cuttlefish. I'm by hook or by crook, I'm going to get the blue color out of it. So you imagine such a thing? Here he's writing it, Yud Aleph Cheshvan, Tuesday, Parshas Vayera, Tuf Reish Mem Zayin, 1887 in Radzin. Imagine the chaloimos of this person. He's dreaming of going down to the Mediterranean Sea. What?
It's really 86 because it's still too early. It's maybe November,
no, why?
December.
Oh, okay, could be, right. But Tuf Reish Mem Zayin, right?
Yeah.
And here, it's, at least this part of it was 1887. It was published in 1887. But be it as it may, the chances of somebody making it from Poland to Italy, it's not min hateva to be able to get down there alive and actually see what's going on the seacoast in Italy. But this is what the Radziner Rebbe is dreaming about. He even wrote a letter to Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan. What do you think about my potential candidate for the Chilazon? And says the Radziner Rebbe, you know what Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan wrote back to me? Nothing. He didn't respond. Oh! He's moida to me. Shtika kahaida, obviously. Obviously, Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan gives me a stamp of approval that this, in fact, is the Chilazon. Now, anyone who's ever dealt with Gedolei Yisrael knows, obviously, that if you ask them a question and they don't respond, obviously they agree with you, right? Everybody knows that. So, says Radziner Rebbe, Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan, the Pasuk Gedor, agrees that if somehow we could extract the blue color, there is no question that this will in fact be the Chilazon. Now, one thing I want to point out, this cuttlefish ain't no fish. The cuttlefish that we're discussing over here was a giant squid. This squid is considered one of, if not the most intelligent creature known to man. It's kuloi brain. Even it has very thin skin. It's all one big brain. It's a very intelligent. Now, I know people have a lot of brains. How much seichel it has, I don't know. Brains it has, because brains and seichel don't necessarily go together. Now, as we're going to see, what blood did they use of this squid? It wasn't its lifeblood. It was the blood that is in a separate pouch or in a separate gland. It's mifkad pakid, which we'll see fits into the way Tosfos in Masechta Shabbos describes the Chilazon. And one of the characteristics of this squid, I'm not going to show you a picture yet, I'm going to hold you in suspense. One of it is that if you get too close to it and you frighten it, it will spritz you with this ink, with this blood, and something like that. But be it as it may, this is the expedition of Rav Gershon Chanoich of Radzin, Rav Gershon Chanoich Liner, who you could just tell if he could just get a ticket to Italy, he's there. And this is what he writes in 1887. Marv Rabbi say, is it worthwhile for us to follow the Radziner Rebbe down to Italy, or is this what we call an expedition in futility? Because let's examine briefly what the Poskim write about whether the Chilazon and whether Techeles is still available today. Well, let's begin with the Rambam. The Rambam in the Parsha Mishnayos, Menachos, in the beginning of the fourth parak. The Rambam writes, what does the Rambam have to say about Techeles? 4 lines on the end. Ve'einoi nimtza b'yadeinu hayom. It is not extant. We don't have it anymore. We don't have Techeles anymore, says the Rambam. Why? L'fi she'einanu yodim l'tsoivai. Erstens, we don't know how to diet. She'ein kol min Techeles b'tzemer nikra Techeles. Not every blue shade of wool is called Techeles. Ela Techeles yodu, it has to be a specific type of blue wool. Meaning, if a guy here is wearing a blue shirt, Alvin, you're wearing Techeles. Where'd you get it from? You went to Italy. You got spritzed by the cuttlefish. What happened? No, it's from Target. Not every blue color is called Techeles. Ela Techeles Yadua She'i Efshar La'asoisa Hayom. It has to be a specific blue that you can't make today. V'alkein anu oisin belavan levade. That is why nowadays we only make white. The Rambam seems to say we don't have Techeles. Why? We don't know how to dye it, and the Rambam even says efshar la'asoisa. It's impossible to make. What does the Shulchan Aruch say? Shulchan Aruch, in my humble opinion, seems to codify that we no longer have Techeles. Shulchan Aruch writes that we know linen and wool strings pater any kind of garment. In other words, some people wear cotton tzitzis. Is one allowed to wear cotton tzitzis? Lahalacha. Yes. Are you yotzim in daraisa? Yes. However, there is a shita of Rava that one should wear wool. It's an appropriate chumrah to wear a wool garment. However, meikar then one is yotzei with cotton, provided that the strings are cotton. Provided that the strings are cotton. Could you put cotton strings on a wool garment? No. Could you put a different material, let's say silk, on a cotton garment? No. So it's knaf min knaf. Whatever type of string, it has to be that material baguette, except for wool and linen. Wool and linen are the wild card. They work on anything. So you could put wool on cotton, you could put linen on cotton. However, says the Shulchan Aruch, linen patters everything. Linen patters everything. However, nowadays you shouldn't use linen on wool or wool on linen. Why? Why not? Because nowadays we're not mekayim tzitzis b'miluai. In the olden days when you had Techeles and you could fulfill tzitzis fully, you're allowed to have shatnez on tzitzis. Asay derechalois asay. But nowadays, says the Shulchan Aruch, that we don't have Techeles, you're not allowed to put linen on wool or wool on linen. So the Shulchan Aruch is not a history book. The Shulchan Aruch seems to be saying as a statement of fact that we don't have Techeles today. We just don't have it. But what if they find it? What if the Radziner Rebbe? No, the Shulchan Aruch seems to say, we don't have Techeles. More than that, the Medrash in this week's Parsha says black and white, Eimosai kishu Techeles. Ve'achshav ein lanu ela lava. Nowadays we only have white. What happened to the blue? Shatcheles nignaz. The blue was hidden. It was goynez. It was put away. Now the lashon of nignaz means hidden away, never to be found again. Like it says the aroin was nignaz, right? Did you ever hear of any Rebbe going to try to find the aroin? The only one who ever tried to find the aroin was... But no, never did you find a movement in Judaism to go search for the Aron, right? The what? And he saw the Aron? Parshas? I don't know. I don't remember. Okay, but be it as it may, it says the Aron was nignaz, and never did anyone try to find it, and nor is there any Indian to try to find it. So why then, if the Medrash says Techeles is nignaz, hidden, we don't look for the Tzimtzenes Haman, we don't look for the Mate of Moshe, we don't look for anything that the Gemara says was nignaz. Why are we searching for the Techeles? More than that, the Arizal seems to say that we are not allowed to wear Techeles today. Not only does he seem to say it, he says it. The Arizal says you're not allowed to wear Techeles anymore. The Arizal writes in the Pri Etz Chaim, he says in number 8, V'nachzer levar ma shekasavti lo'el, ki ha'emes hu, shebizman hazeh, nowadays achar achorben, ein banu koyach lahato Techeles. We don't have the strength to put on Techeles. Meaning, even if we would have it and we could find it, we wouldn't have the koyach to put it on. The Arizal repeats himself in the Sha'ar Kavanis, the number 9. He says there are two types of colors, and when the Beis Hamikdash stood, there was blue, bizman hazeh, we only have white. Comes the Heilige Ben Ish Chai in a tshuva, and the Ben Ish Chai writes that the Arizal is serious when he says that we don't have Techeles and we don't have the strength to put it on. Says the Ben Ish Chai, the blinding spiritual energy of Techeles is so powerful that when the Beis Hamikdash doesn't stand, we don't have the spiritual wherewithal to protect ourselves from that blinding energy. Says the Ben Ish Chai, that Unavar Atar Tzitishon Nurgim Zanazeshim Lavan Ki Emesu Af Bezman Azeh Einor Chachma D'ima Nifsak Ein lanu ata koyach sheyasa adarhu al yadenu. So interesting. So there seems to be a Kabbalistic reason that you're not allowed to wear a Techeles b'zman hazeh. More than that, Rabbi says. So far, with the Rambam says we don't have it. It would be impossible to make. Shulchan Aruch says it's gone. The Medrash says it's hidden. The Arizal says we can't do it. The Ben Ish Chai said it would be spiritually damaging. Comes the Sifri. And the Sifri says, Amar Rabbi Yosi, Pamachas hayisi mahalech mechziv letzur. I was once walking from Kaziv to Tzur, and I met an old man, and I said, how you doing? And I said, Rabbi Yid, what do you do for a living? Are you a doctor or a lawyer? Amar li mechilazain. I'm a chilazain farmer, capturer, fisherman. So Rabbi Yid said, what are you talking about? There is no more chilazain today. He says, Amar li, Hashamayim, I swear. Makoim biyam, it should say. That's the correct Gersa. There's a place in the sea, Shemuta Baharam of Asamiyos, Makisha Soisai, that in the deep underground labyrinths under the mountains, there's water with poisonous spiders that guard the chilazain. Okay, now this sounds very scary. It sounds like, in the Galapagos Islands. Under the mountains, in a very deep body of water, dark, with biting spiders. Umes, and if the spider bites you, you'll die. V'nim like b'mkami, you will melt in your place. That's where I farm the chilazain. So Rabbi Yossi said, I think I asked too much already, But that's what this Zaken said, that he captures chilazain in the dark labyrinths under the mountains with biting poisonous spiders. So Rabbi Yossi said, Amarti hashamayim nizkaru shenignaz l'tzadim l'salavai. So I see, Taka, that the chilazon, in fact, is put away for the tzaddikim la'asalavai. So Rabbi say, it seems pretty clear. The Rambam says we don't have it; it's impossible to have it. The Shulchan Aruch says it's batal. The Arizal says we can't use it. The Ben Ish Chai says it will harm us, and the Sifri says the only way to get it is to fight poisonous spiders, which I'm not really interested in doing. So if all we're dealing with is snorkeling with the Radziner Rebbe, I'm in. But once you get the poisonous spiders involved, I think I'm going to stay home and ask him how the trip was when he came back. So it would seem that the search for chilazon would be an exercise in futility. By the way, if I were to ask you, historically, when did the chilazon end? When did it cease? When was it nignaz? So we saw that the Arizal said, Achar hachurben ein banu koyach lahatel hatchelas. Or the Arizal says, Bizman shebeis hamikdash kayam, we had Techeles, and now that the Beis Hamikdash is destroyed, we don't have it. So it would seem to indicate that in the year 70, when the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, the Techeles was nignaz. But that is absolutely and certainly incorrect. Because we know in the times of the Mishnah they had it, and we know in the times of the Gemara they had it. There are many Gemaras that say openly that the Amoraim had and utilized Techeles. Case in point, number 12. The Gemara Menachos, Daf Mem Gimel. Mar mi Mishchi aisi Techelta b'shnei Rabachai. Mar from Mishchi brought Techeles in the years of Rabachai. Now, Rabachai lived in the 5th century. That means Techeles was still in possession of Klal Yisrael in the 5th century. Look at number 13. Shalchu leila Rava. A pair of people came from Rekes, and they had a secret thing. And what they have? Techeles. They had to smuggle Techeles. So you might want to know, why did they have to smuggle Techeles? Why was Techeles contraband? The answer was that there was a Roman decree, because Roman officials and kings used the Techeles as a royal color. Techeles was always considered a way of dyeing royalty. They made a decree that any Jew that dealt in Techeles would be killed, and therefore the Jews had to smuggle it and hide it. What?
When was it written? Because over there it says Dignas.
Right.
So, just I don't know the time.
It would have to be...
Because you're saying 5th century, it's both. When Parava says it's earlier.
When was Bamidbar Rabbah written?
By Tanai. It was written by Tanai. Which is 2nd, 3rd century.
I don't know. I can't answer that.
To know him,
I don't know. Okay.
was the Tanam on? Couldn't be the residual from me before.
Yeah, it could be that they were able to preserve it and use it later. After all, there are Gemaras that say that the chilazon surfaced every 70 years, which means that they were able to get dye from it for at least 70 years. But for how long they're able to obtain the dye, that we don't know. So, Marv Rabbi, we know one thing, that we have many sources that the Techeles was nignaz, the chilazon was nignaz, but we do know that it was in use at least until the 5th century. It would seem then that searching for Techeles on the Mediterranean would be a exercise in futility. Furthermore, Rabbi Isai, if you look at number 17, the Gemara in Shabbos says on the pasuk in Techeles, "B'chol eis yiyu begadecha levanim." At all times, your garments should be white. That refers to tzitzis. V'shemen al roshcha al yachzar. That refers to tefillin. Frek the Gemara, what do you mean at all times your begadim should be white refers to tzitzis? But we know Techeles was nignas, Techeles was batal. Says the Marsha, this is going on the Lavan. The Lavan was b'choles, l'doyroisechem. Mashein came the Techeles, a time will come that the Techeles will cease. And then there's another argument against the search for Techeles, and that seems to be the simple reading of the pasuk in this week's Parsha. And this is a very important diak. Let's go back to number 1. Daber al bnei Yisrael, v'yamarta aleim, v'yasu lohem tzitzis, al kanfei v'gdeihem, l'doyroisam, v'nasnu al tzitzis hakanaf p'sil Techeles. Grammatically, the word l'doyroisam is not in the right place. It should say you should make tzitzis on the corners, v'nasnu al tzitzis hakanaf p'sil Techeles, l'doyroisam. Why does it interrupt the word l'doyroisam between the Lavan and the Techeles? Why is l'doyroisam only going on the words v'yasu lohem tzitzis? Why does it say stick in the word l'doyroisam and then write v'nasnu al tzitzis hakana p'sil Techeles? So we have Gimel, Nevi'im, Misnavim, Besignoin Echad, 3 great Torah giants who all make the exact same point. The Alshich, the Archaim HaKadosh, the Chsam Sofer all write. This comes to teach that the mitzvah of Lavan, the mitzvah of white, that's l'doyroisam, that's for all generations. But the mitzvah of Techeles is not for all generations, because the time will come that we no longer have Techeles. That is why the Torah interrupts, says the Alshech, says Archaim HaKadosh, says the Chsam Sofer, look at number 21. Ramaz lanu, ki mitzvahs Lavan shel tzitzis yeh l'doyroisam, lo yizbata la'olam. But then, al tzitzis are going to p'sil Techeles, that's not l'doyroisam. Ki b'zman hazeh, there's no chilazon and there's no Techeles. So Marv Rabbi say, we've offered many arguments why it's not worthwhile and it's really a waste of time to look for tzitzis. The Rambam says it's impossible to find it. The Shulchan Aruch says we don't have it. The Arizal says it's not good for us. The Medrash says it was nignaz. The Sifri says it's guarded by vicious spiders. The Pasuk says it's not l'doyroisam. However, none of these arguments are halachic arguments. Nothing we said so far is a halachically sound argument to prevent us and deter us from looking for the Techeles. Number 1, the Medrash says it was nignaz. The first thing that you need to know is that we do not paskin halachas from Midrashim. The fact that the Medrash says it was nignaz, okay, if we find it, we'll have to deal with the Medrash. But we're not going to paskin halacha based on a Medrash. Number 2, does anybody know what the word nignaz means? Literally, it means it was hidden. But the Eitz Yosef says, not this time. Look at number 22. The Eitz Yosef says, in this instance, you know what nignaz means? Nishtakach. It was forgotten. And guess what? If we find it, it will be remembered. That's all. We forgot it. There's no doubt we forgot it. The question is, just because you forget something, you're allowed to remember it? That's what happens every time you learn something. You remember what you forgot. So if we find it, we'll remember it. Yeah, the Medrash says it was nignaz. Nignaz means forgotten. But now we'll remember it. The Arizal says we can't put on Techeles. Listen carefully. You have to know how to read an Arizal. Just because the Arizal says not to do something, he doesn't mean not to do it. Just because the Arizal says you shouldn't do something, he doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. Says there's a tshuva from Rabbi Yaakov Hillel, who writes, many people are misled because they read the Arizal and they say the Arizal says not to do it. When the Arizal says not to do something, he never means not to do it. Really? Yeah. So if you don't know that, you can't even open up an Arizal. That's the first thing you need to know. The Arizal, unless the Arizal says, Ani, Hayresi, Halacha, Ulamaisa, Al, Loi, then he's serious. But if he just says don't do something, the Arizal's talking b'derech mashal. He's speaking in Kabbalistic terms. And somebody wrote a letter to Rabbi Yaakov Hillel about the Ari. The Ari says, you're not allowed to marry a woman older than you. You know that? The Arizal says, you're not allowed to marry a woman older than you. Says Rabbi Yaakov Hillel, anytime the Ari says not to do something, if it doesn't have a makar in Chazal and the Gemara, you can do it, you should do it. He doesn't even mean not to do it. So what does the Ari mean, don't marry a woman older than you? You know what he means? The Arizal is just observing the fact that most people marry women who are younger than them. And he's stating a reality. And commenting on that reality, the Arizal is explaining a Kabbalistic reason why people marry women younger than them. But if a guy marries a woman older than them, Mazel Tov, invite me to the wedding, I'll be there, I'll dance. There's nothing wrong with marrying a woman older than you. So too here, many suggest, just because the Arizal says not to wear Techeles, he doesn't mean not to wear Techeles. Commenting on the reality that we don't have Techeles and people don't wear it, the Arizal is explaining why. But if you find it, then you need to wear it. You're not going to be swayed halachically because the Arizal says not to do something. The Arizal speaks in couched, veiled terms. He's not talking lahalacha. Only, says Rabbi Yaakov Hillel, in Shalshus Vayeshev Hayom, Siman Chaf, Rak im Omar lahedya b'derech hayra lemaisa itzivoy lemaisa vaday it's nachay. Now, even if the question, if the Arizal says you're not allowed to do this halacha ulamaisa, you have to follow. Not mechuyev to follow the Arizal. It's only milsa de chasidusa. Now, if you are a very righteous, pious person, and you want to follow minhagei chasidus, then you should. But an average Jew, you can't make the words of the Arizal binding on them. But in this situation, the Arizal never even said halacha l'maisa. He just said words, you shouldn't wear Techeles, which is just a comment on the reality of the situation. Let me share with you an incredible tshuva I saw from the Satmar Rebbe. Shalos Tshuva is Divrei Yoel, Chelak Aleph, Siman Mem Daled. Satmar Rebbe is commenting on the fact that, wait a second, we're going to dye tzitzis with a chilazon. According to some Rishonim, the chilazon was like a worm or a squid. Is that a kosher fish? It's not a kosher fish. Isn't there a rule when it comes to mitzvahs? Lamantia taras Hashem beficha min hamutar beficha, that you can only use an item that you're allowed to eat for a mitzvah. For example, tefillin need to be made out of a kosher behema. The cloth has to be made out of a kosher behema. All mitzvahs, shofar has to be from a kosher animal. All mitzvahs are hukash letefillin, lamantia taras Hashem beficha. So how could you, on the tzitzis, color it with the dye of a chilazon, which is not even a kosher animal? And this is a question we're going to deal with halachically at the end of the shiur, but right now we're going to speak about it more al pi machshava, based on what's written in the Divrei Yoel from Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz and the Yismach Moshe. He says a very brilliant idea. He says like this: really? You could only use for mitzvahs a davar tahar and a davar kadosh? Anybody here ever see Hashem's Kisei HaKavod? Raise your hand if you've seen the Kisei HaKavod. Okay, good. You're paying attention. But raise your hand if you know what's on the Kisei HaKavod. Ari, Nesher. Is a lion kosher? No. is a nesher kosher. So why, if God wants us, if God is so makted that on our mitzvahs we have to be careful, why on His throne is there an arena nesher? So says Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz, well, wait a second. God created the world. To Him, He sees the entire universe beskira achas in one glance. To Him, there's no difference between the kisei hakavod and the bottom of the ocean floor. So if there are lions in the world and there are eagles in the world, they could be on the kisei. There's no nafkamina between the kisei hakavod and the bottom or the middle of the jungle. But for us, when we do a mitzvah, we have to be careful that the item of the mitzvah be only from a kosher behema. But there's one exception. You know what that exception is? If there's a mitzvah that you do, that the purpose of that mitzvah is to imagine yourself standing at the kisei hakavod, then whatever the rules of the kisei hakavod are, the rules will be for that mitzvah. What mitzvah is there that the objective of that mitzvah is to be at the kisei hakavod? Techeles. Techeles doimel liyam. Yam is doimel l'rakia. Rakia is doimel l'kisei hakavod. So the purpose of Techeles is to be at the kisei hakavod. At the kisei hakavod you can have an ari, you can have a nesher, and you can have a chalazoin, says the Satmar Rebbe. But says the Satmar Rebbe, that's why we don't have Techeles anymore. Why? So he says, this is mamish ga'inas. There's a Gemara in Masechta Brachos. The Gemara says an incredible thing. The Gemara says on Daf Nun Tes, Miyoim shecharav beis hamikdash. I'm in number 24 on the left-hand column on page 3, paragraph 3, Ulai. In the middle paragraph, says the Satmar Rebbe, the Gemara says in Brachos Daf Nun Tes, Miyoim shecharav beis hamikdash, loy nira harakia b'taharasai. From the day the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, we never saw the rakia the way the rakia should look. It's never blue the way it's never true blue. Shenemar al bishamayim kidrois. V'sak asim kesusa. Meaning, nowadays that the Beis Hamikdash is destroyed, the sky is never blue. Says the Satmar Rebbe, if the point of the Techeles is to remind you of the Yam, to remind you of the Rakia, to remind you of the Kisei HaKavod, but we don't know what the Rakia looks like anymore. We don't have a Rakia. We don't have a Rakia, then we don't need Techeles anymore. That's why Techeles is batal. Because the whole purpose is to remind you of the Rakia, to remind you of the Kisei HaKavod. But if you don't have the true color, so then you don't need the Techeles. That's why Hashgacha has it, that we don't have Techeles anymore. Then he says further. So if the whole purpose of the Techeles is to remember the connection of heaven and earth. Yam, Rakia, Kisei HaKavod. What is the legs of the Kisei HaKavod in this world? What is the reflection of the Kisei HaKavod? Beis HaMikdash. So the whole purpose of Techeles is to remember the connection of heaven and earth. And what connects heaven and earth is a Mikdash. If you don't have a Mikdash, there's really no point in having Techeles. And that's why we don't have Techeles anymore, says the Satmar Rebbe. And then he says one of the most ironic things that I've ever seen. You'll see why. What's pshat in the Purim story, he says? Why is everyone so happy? Everyone's happy when they see the Techeles of Mordechai. Says the Satmar Rebbe, why is the Techeles of Mordechai, why does that inspire so much simcha? Because if Techeles is only important when you have a Beis HaMikdash, that means in order for Techeles to reappear, that means the Beis HaMikdash is coming. So when they see Mordechai finally having the Techeles, they realize it's Aschalta de Geulta, says the Satmar Rebbe. It's the beginning of the Geula. They realize it's the Haschalas HaGeula. And that's why Beroisam Yachad Shoshanas Yachad Samecha Beroisam Yachad Techeles Mordechai. I read to you his words. Ela Sha'az BeYeshua Shayalem Aydemar Chesar Haya Aschalta de Geulta Mamish Shenis'ala the Koyach HaKadusha Umisnoitzeitz the Binyan Beis HaMikdash. So, what? Kasha, I don't know. When you got it, you got it. The Sifri says that the Techeles is guarded by poisonous snakes. So Rav David Pardo, the author of the Maskil David on Chumash, writes, you have to know how to read a Sifri. Avada and Avada, he says, Al Pi Kabbalah, there's different types of Techeles. And the Techeles of La'asad Lavai is guarded by poisonous snakes. But that doesn't mean there is not natural Techeles that is still accessible. And he says, I found this idea in the Arizal himself. So far, really, nothing we've seen should really deter us from looking for Techeles. The Medrash says it was Nignaz. You're not going to paskin halachas from Midrashim. If we find it, you're going to have to use it. And more than that, maybe you should look for it. The fact that the Arizal said you shouldn't put on Techeles, he doesn't mean la halacha you shouldn't put on Techeles. And the Sifri said it's guarded by poisonous snakes. That means the future Techeles is guarded by poisonous snakes. When it comes to halacha, there's only one place you could look. The Poskim. Because halacha doesn't follow Midrashim, it follows the Gemara and the Rishonim and the Poskim. What do the Poskim say about Techeles? Can it come back, or is it lost forever? Kam Shaus Shuvas Radvaz, Chelek Beis, Siman Taf Reish Pehei. He's going on the Gemara in Shabbos about those who trap the Chilazayin. He's speaking about a pasuk in Yirmiyah that Nevuzradin left people in Eretz Yisrael to trap Chilazayin. Says the Heilige Radvaz, even though everything we've said, Lefi Shahaya Matzoi, the Chilazayin after Kol HaMaisas was found. Ve'efshir Sha'arayoimu Matzoi. It could be it's still found till today. Elashem Akir Naisai. We don't know exactly what it is. Oishen Yon Letzaidai. But be it as it may, the Radvaz writes clearly, Techeles could come back. More than that. So you say Radvaz, he was a Rishon. But like the Achronim that we follow, like, does anybody know, in the beginning of the Mishnah Berurah, Chelek Aleph, Hilchos Tzitzis, does anybody know there's one Paisek that, since he has a commentary on this part of Archaim, the Mishnah Berurah quotes him every single page? The Malbim, in the Artzis Achayim. The Malbim writes on Siman Tes, this is amazing halacha. The halacha is, the Shulchan Aruch says, you're not allowed to wear linen strings. You hear this? Even on linen. Bisman Hazeh, you're not allowed to wear linen strings even on linen. You say, what's wrong with linen strings on linen? Because we're afraid that you might put on Techeles. So what's wrong with putting on Techeles? You're allowed, if you have linen strings, and then Techeles other strings, you're allowed to have it on tzitzis. But you might put it on at night when it's not as man tzitzis, and you're going to be wearing shatnez shaloi b'shas asiyas hamitzvah.
What? Linen on linen?
Linen lavan, tcheles tzemer, on a linen beged. So, but you're allowed to do that. We're afraid you might wear it at night. So the Malbim asks, so what? But why are we geyser this bisman hazeh? There's no tcheles bisman hazeh. So you should be allowed to wear linen on linen bisman hazeh. Right? That's the Malbim's kasha. Right? The Shulchan Aruch says you're not allowed to wear bisman hazeh, linen on linen, lest you come to put on tcheles. But we don't have tcheles bisman hazeh. Says the Malbim, you're right, but we're worried it's going to come back. Where it's going to come back? But the Medrash says nignaz. Arizal says you're not allowed to wear it. Ben Ish Chai writes it's spiritually going to hurt us. That's all Midrashim. But lahalacha, you're not allowed to wear linen on linen, says the Malbim. Says the Malbim, look at number 27. The ayin v'shal shus radvaz, who says efshar shagam hayom hu matzoi ulefizeh yeshama degam besadin betzitzes yeshash teshama yilmadu. Shalas Teshuvas Maril writes, the halacha l'maisa, we're afraid we're going to find it. So just because we have all these sources, Arizal, Midrashim, that it's nignaz, but the Poskim say it could come back. The Malbim says it could come back. Shashus Maril says it could come back. And if the Radziner Rebbe wants to go snorkeling looking for it, then we're all obligated to follow him and to try to find the Techeles. And therefore, the Radziner Rebbe wrote another work, number 29, another sefer, which we have over here, the Maimer Psil Techeles. In 1888, 1 year later, most people it takes them 50 years to write a sefer. He wrote it the next year. And he says, we know that Techeles means that the Geula is misnoitze. It's like, it's shining, it's sparkling. And the year Tirachem, Tafresh Memches, he says, this is the year that's Misugal for the coming of Mashiach. And he says, a year has passed, and I've gotten many letters from many Gedolei Yisrael, and nobody has sort of uprooted my quest and my search for Techeles. They've asked specific questions that I hope I'll be able to answer. And the Radziner Rebbe describes to us in great detail what this fish looks like. You know how he knows? Because he'd made the arduous trip down to Italy, into Napoli. Where's Napoli? Naples. And in Naples, I believe in the 1870s, a new aquarium opened up on the seacoast, which had glass walls, which allowed you to literally get into the sea and see the animals and the fish in their natural habitat. And this Polish Rebbe traveled to Italy to try to come up with the one of the 19 species of cuttlefish that he could get his hands on, alive, and produce the blue dye, and to bring it to Klal Yisrael. And when he was there, he read a lot about the cuttlefish. This was a fish that captured the imagination of all the naturalists and all the scientists and all the ancients. He even writes, see if I could find it, that a contemporary of his, and you'll see why nowadays this ain't going to go if you're a Rebbe. He says one of his great contemporaries writes extensively on the cuttlefish, aside from the fact that Aristotle himself was fascinated with the cuttlefish. One of his contemporaries in Britannia, in Britain, a man by the name of Darwin, was fascinated with the cuttlefish, says Radziner Rebbe. I don't know of too many Rebbes that quote Darwin as one of their Marma Mekomos. And Darwin, yeah, you know what they say? Who are the four most influential people in the 20th century, in the 19th century? Einstein, Marx, Freud, and Darwin. And they say 3 were Jewish and Darwin was wrong, But that's the Radziner Rebbe quotes. Darwin was fascinated with this brain of a jellyfish. Be it as it may, the Radziner Rebbe put his nose and his eyes up against the glass in Naples, and he sees staring him in the face the Glatstein. Here we have a picture of the cuttlefish, which was identified as a Glatstein by none other than the Radziner Rebbe. And he describes it in very great detail. And by the way, this is a monster. It's tremendous, it's huge, it's powerful. The suction that it has, it could hide in the cleft of any rock. You could get a bulldozer come to drag it away, it ain't moving. You don't want to get close to a cuttlefish. Or, in other words, you don't want to cuddle with a cuttlefish. So, this was a power, but if you get your hands on it alive, the Radziner Rebbe was able to get it alive, and in fact, there was an Italian fisherman who was able to extract a blue color from the gland of this cuttlefish. Marv Rabbi say, but let's deal with a tremendous halachic problem. Look at number 30, that he deals with in the work that he wrote in the year Terachim, 1888, and that is the Gemara in Masechta Shabbos on Daf Chav Chesed Beis says, Laman tia Toras Hashem beficha, you need min hamutar beficha. You can't make the ritzuos of tefillin out of a horse, chas v'shalom. You can't make klaf out of a non-kosher behema. So how are we going to make tzitzis out of this squid, which this ain't no fish. It has snapir, but no kaskasas. Maybe it's even a sheretz. So how are we allowed to use tzitzis for, how are we allowed to use this for tzitzis? Well, this is also, you see how while we're on the road, while we're on the way, together with Zina Rebbe, we're going to pick up a lot of important yediyos. The Chassam Sofer, who was not interested at all in this particular subject because it was 100 years after him, he writes Agavorcha that in his times, there was an oil that came from a dog tameh that they would use to shellac and coat the ritzuos. And they asked the Chassam Sofer, this is in the Chassam Sofer Yardei Siman Reish Ayin Vav, he said, are you allowed to use this to shellac the coating of the tefillin? After all, we know Rabbi Bechai says, you ever notice silk is not one of the materials used in the Mishkan? Why is silk not used in the Mishkan? Because silk comes from a worm, and Rabbi Bechai says that the worm produces something called hayotzei min hatamei tamei. Anything that comes out of something which is tamei is tamei. So, what about toilah shani? Toilah shani is a red scarlet color that comes from a worm. Says Chasam Sofer. So what do we see from here? Silk you can't use because that would be making the material itself out of something which is not kosher. But merely the dye and the color of something is not the chefza shel mitzvah itself. It's merely something that's enhancing the appearance of the chefza shel mitzvah. We see from the Mishkan that something which is merely a coloring or a dye, it's permitted to use an animal which is not kosher. And therefore, says Chasam Sofer, it is mutter to use a non-kosher fish, the oil to coat the hides of the Ritzuais. Says Chasam Sofer, I don't know for sure, he says, Chimedum Ali, that the chilazain is not kosher. Meaning, I don't know for sure what the chilazain is, but I think it's not kosher. So how could they use it for tzitzis? Is a raya that something which is merely the coating is permitted? Says Chasam Sofer, I personally am machmir, and I do not coat my tefillin with the oil of a non-kosher fish, but it's mutter l'chachila. The Noid Yehuda wrote a tshuva, Madur Tinyana, Simon Gimel, and he wanted to know. Apparently, it was big stuff. It was very popular to coat the ritzuais with the oil of a non-kosher fish. And one of the arguments that the Noid Yehuda came up with originally was, we know, the Yalkut says in Parshas Boy, that a reward for the dogs, shalayechatz kelav l'shoinoi, is that we use their excrement to treat the hides of animals for tefillin. So what do we see from here? That even something which is not kosher, because kol hayotzei min hatamei, you're allowed to use it for Sifrei Torah, tefillin, and mezuzos. But then the Noid Yehuda said, it's not really analogous. Because there, you're just treating the hides, but ultimately you're washing it off, and there's no residue of it that remains on the item of the mitzvah. Masha'in kain, if you're painting something with an item which is not kosher, there is a remnant of a davar which is tamei on the chefza shel mitzvah. And then the Noid Yehuda says the same raya as the Chasam Sofer, that if you're going to learn like some Rishonim, you see some Rishonim learn that the chilazon was a dug. If it's a dug, then it's a dug. Maybe you could say it's a dug kosher. But if you learn like Rashi is mashma elsewhere in Shas, and we'll get into this more in a future shiur, that it was a sheretz, l'chayra then, it would be a proof that you could color a chefza shel mitzvah with which is something which is a davar tamei. Masha'in kain, if it's a fish, you could say it's a kosher fish, and then we wouldn't have a raya. But ultimately, the Noid Yehuda says that in the case of this oil from a non-kosher fish, you're not even coloring the ritzuos with it. You're merely, the color is entirely that's black is from a kosher animal. You're just using it to preserve the color or to create a certain gloss on the color. So that's not even the color. It's just a small ingredient that everybody would agree is okay. So this issue that some poskim had with the Radziner Rebbe, that the Techeles was not kosher, the poskim already dealt with regarding tefillin, and l'chara is not a problem. It doesn't have to be a kosher animal. Okay, is it okay? I want to finish the part one, because basically this subject has like 6 or 7 parts, and I don't want to extend it longer than that. So if you give me 10 minutes, if you got to go, you got to go. When you got to go, you got to go. Yeah? But just I want to finish up.
Which one was it? It's a schooner, not to wear it. Yoda?
The Arizal, what? The Arizal said it's the Ben Ish Chai?
Yeah.
Okay, again, that's a Kabbalistic reason, but bottom line, if the poskim say it could come back and we could identify it, so, well, you got to wear it. Okay, so there... What about honey? Okay, that's a question on honey, but we eat honey. The minhag is to eat honey. The reason is because it doesn't really go into the body of the bee. the bee doesn't put it inside its body. It's on the outside, it constructs it. So it's not considered Yotze Min HaTamei. Okay. One of the Gedolei Hador who lived in the times of the Radziner Rebbe was Rabbi Shiur Mikutna. Shiur comes one of the great Go'inim, Polish Go'inim. In fact, my family has a tradition that my great-great-grandfather of Pesach Moshe Goldman was a Talmud of the Yeshua's Malka, Rabbi Shiur Mikutna, and somehow he had something to do with helping publish Shal Sechuvas Yeshua's Malka. Okay, for whatever that's worth. So the Radziner Rebbe comes to Yeshua's Malka and he says, Rebbe, maybe we should wear Techeles. I think I found it. Here it is. So the Rebbe said, the Olam was not Makabel it. Right? The Rabbi Shiur Mikutna said, the Olam was not Makabel your Techeles. So whereupon the Radziner Rebbe calls out the window. He says to the water carrier, what's the halacha of chametz mishei shoy sulamala? He says, I don't know. Why don't you ask Rabbi Shiur Mikutna? Turns Radziner Rebbe to Rabbi Shiur Mikutna. He says, look, the Gemara in Pesachim says, chametz mishei shoy sulamala, kul alma loy pligi, the whole world agrees. But I asked the world, and he doesn't know. But the Gemara says the whole world knows. The teretz is, Amaratzim are not part of the world. The world is just the Gadol Hador. You're the world. So I'm asking you. You tell me the world is not Makabel. I'm asking you to be Makabel. He wasn't Makabel. And he says an incredible thing. Rabbi Shiur Mikutna. They were contemporaries. Yeah? So in the Shal Sechuvas Yeshua's Malkai, he dedicates Tshuva Aleph, Beis, and Gimel to the subject of Techeles. And he writes an incredible thing. I have a question. If you have white and you don't have blue, are you Yotze the Mitzvah or you're not Yotze the Mitzvah? Question. Are you Yotze the Mitzvah? Those of us who don't have blue on your tzitz, are you Yotze or you're not? Yes. But it's not so clear, because it's look in number 33. It's a Mishnah in Menachos. The Mishnah says, Techeles is not ma'akev the Lavan. Lavan is not ma'akev the Techeles. Says the Gemara, that's not like Rebbe. The Tanya Risem Oisai. Me'akvin zeh Divrei Rebbe. The Chachamim oimrim in ma'akev. So it's a machlokes Rebbe and the Chachamim. Rebbe says, if you don't have blue, you have nothing. The Chachamim say it's not ma'akev each other. Now we hope, we paskin like the Chachamim. And the Rambam, the Rif, and the Rosh paskin like the Chachamim. Comes the Baal Amar, and the Baal Amar says the halacha is like Rebbe. Why? Yachid v'Rabim halacha k'Rabim. That's because in the Gemara identifies Man Chachamim Rabbi Yitzchak. The Gemara identifies the Chachamim are Rabbi Yitzchak. And now there's a cloud, Rebbe v'Chaveirav halacha k'Rebbe. So the Baal Amar paskins like Rebbe. We don't paskin like the Baal Amar. Says Rabbi Shiur Mikutna Againas. He says, you know why Techeles was nignaz? It was always dangerous to deal in Techeles. It was always Roman royalty that wore Techeles. But he says an amazing thing. In the year 500, in the year 600, in the year 700, in the year 800, in the year 900, in the year 1000, before there was something called the Shulchan Aruch, what was the halacha? Do you have to have Techeles or do you not have to have Techeles? The answer is it was a major machlokes. So what did people do? We didn't have any decisive conclusion. Many Gedolim said you must have Techeles. As long as there existed an opinion in Klal Yisrael that Techeles is ma'akev tzitzis, then by hook or by crook, Klal Yisrael got their hands on Techeles. After all, if you don't have Techeles, you have nothing. And we know the Torah says l'day roisam, that tzitzis will be forever and ever. Comes the Shulchan Aruch, and he paskins halachas like the Rambam, the Rif, and the Rosh, that if you don't have blue, it's still okay. Oh, so that means we don't have to be choishish for the Baal Amar. And we don't have to worry about Rebbe Shita. And if we just have white and we don't have blue, it's nishgefelach. Then Klal Yisrael, they're not moiser nefesh anymore to try to get a hold of the blue, because it's not really that critical. As long as we didn't have a definitive halacha, then Klal Yisrael had to really risk their lives to get a hold of the blue. But once we have a definitive psak that we're not choishish for Shitas Rebbe, that's when Techeles became obsolete. At the end of the day, the Radziner Rebbe came over to Rabbi Shiur Mikutna, and he says, let me just find what I'm looking for. he came to Rabbi Shula Mikutna, and he says, Rebbe, Rav, why don't we put on Techeles? I think I know what it is. I went to Italy. I saw the tint fish. I saw the cuttlefish. I have a picture of it, colored picture. Why shouldn't we do it? So the Rabbi Shula Mikutna in Siman Beis, in number 36, writes, "V'navai l'nidan didan," that the Radziner Rebbe thinks he found the right fish. Says the Yeshuas Malkai, he thinks he found the right fish. It's a svara ba'alma. It's not. We have no conclusive evidence. This is it. The Gemara says it's a rare thing to find it, and he found a fish that is throughout the Mediterranean Sea. And all the questions we're going to ask on him that he's going to answer, it's just svara ba'alma. You're not mechuyev to do something because somebody has a good idea. He writes, l'chayra, you should do it because it's at least a suffix, so it doesn't hurt. You're right. Taka, that's a good svara. Meaning, if you want to say, why not? It doesn't hurt to put it on. I agree to that. It doesn't hurt to put it on. But to say that you're mechuyev to put it on because of why not, you can't obligate somebody to do something just because you have a good idea and it doesn't hurt. Right? I think you should stand on your left foot, jump up and down, because it's good for cardiovascular activity. Why not? It's not going to hurt. I'm not mechuyev to do it because you have a good idea. So I'm not mechuyev. No, it's not. It's not a problem. That's what Rabbi Shula Mikutna says. It wouldn't be a problem if it's not Techeles. According to Rabbi Shula Mikutna, we will definitely get into that subject in upcoming. But the opinion of Rabbi Shula Mikutna is, there are poskim that say, if it's not Techeles, it's not even Lavan. However, Rabbi Shula Mikutna paskins that if it's not Techeles, it's still Lavan. But he says, since we don't have Yediyah Brura about this, and the das of the Gedolei Yisrael in general is it's nignaz, and we're not mechuyev in it, says Rabbi Shula Mikutna, I don't tell you to listen to me. I'm not imposing my view on anybody. And I'm not telling anyone to remove their Techeles if they want to wear it. But I'm also not telling anybody that they're mechuyev to wear Techeles. Bottom line is, he says in Siman Gimel, other problems with why he thinks that even if it would be the right Techeles, there would still be a lot of questions. And that is, we're going to get to this also in the future Shiurim. There's a major machlekes Rishonim, Rashi, and the Rambam. Whether, when you make the Techeles, are you allowed to put in other ingredients? Rashi learns if you put in other ingredients, it's pasul. The Rambam says you're allowed to put in other ingredients. So what do? We never had a Shulchan Aruch to paskin between the Rashi and the Rambam. Why? Because it was never relevant. So says Rabbi Shula Mikutna, whatever you're going to do, 50% you got it wrong. So I'm mechuyev to go find it, even if it's the right one. If I do it one way, it could be I'm doing it wrong anyway. Bottom line. No, the Rambam holds you need to, because the Gemara, can I show you why? The Rambam sheet is, if you look at number 15, the Gemara implies, Maisina Adam Chelazon V'Samonin, and you put in ingredients. So the Rambam sheet says you must put in other ingredients. Rashi learns you're not allowed to. Now there are going to be other issues. How do you tie it? How many strings of blue do you put in? They're going to see there are 3 sheets in the Rishonim, Rashi, the Rambam, and the Ravid, I think. According to each one, the other one is wrong. So just chances are, you don't know whether to put in Samanim, you don't know how to tie it, in all likelihood you're not even getting it. But the Radziner Rebbe said, but it doesn't hurt. Maybe you are getting it. If maybe you would make $1 million, I have a question. There are people buy lottery tickets. I have a cash on them, but they're probably not going to win. Yeah, but maybe I'm going to win. So too, maybe I'm Mikayim Mitzvahs Tzitzis B'Miluay. And therefore, one of the things that really got the Radziner Rebbe excited is he saw the blood of this chilazon was mifgad pakad, which, by the way, look at number 37, is a sheet of Rabbeinu Tam. Rabbeinu Tam says, V'heshiv lo Rabbeinu Tam dedam chilazon haroi letzvia mifgad pakad. And therefore comes the year 1889, Chanukah. So you'd say maybe it's still 1888, yeah? I trusted it and I tried and I put in different ingredients until finally says the Radziner Rebbe, jackpot, I was able to produce a beautiful blue color. And as soon as I got that blue color, I was able to sell it to thousands of Jews. The Radziner Rebbe kept an exact accounting of every single person who bought the Techeles from him. So nowadays, I think it costs about $150. What? What does that mean? What do you mean?
Next to Malay Agumim, there is a place for the...
It's cheaper there?
I don't know, but...
Okay. Okay. So he was able to sell it to thousands of Jews. In fact, the record is he sold it to...
12,000.
And look in the next paragraph. Reish Shnas Taf Reish Nun. Now we're up to 1890. I began to die. I got my. You see, in the beginning, he said, it took a lot of ink to produce one pair of tzitzis until I got it down to a science. I perfected it, and then I was able to produce. He says, "The Ezras Hashem harbe alofim Yisrael itil tcheles v'gdei tzitziosim ukayom yoiser mishem asar of Yisrael kvar lov tcheles." More than 12,000 Jews are wearing tcheles, and it's catching on, and it's the latest fad. And every day I'm getting letters from all over the world. People in Österreich, Ungarn, Friesen, Lita. Everyone's wearing Techeles. Comes Aruch HaShulchan. And the Aruch HaShulchan writes, Bizman hazeh we don't have Techeles. He says, V'da, shezeh shanim sefurais. Now let me just tell you a little story. Did any Gedolim put on the Techeles? Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan? No. He didn't write back. Unlikely it was a shtika kahida. The Malbim, we don't know that he wore Techeles. They sent it to the Chavetz Chaim. Chavetz Chaim said, I have no kayach to get involved in this. However, legend has it that Rabbi Itzula Panovitcher wore the Radziner Rebbe's Techeles. The Marsham, legend has it that he wore the Radziner Rebbe's Techeles, and he wrote in his tzava that he wants to be buried in the Radziner Rebbe's Techeles. However, for the most part, it was not accepted at all. It was not accepted, not by Gedolim and not by Klal Yisrael. The Aruch HaShulchan writes, V'da, shezeh shanim sefurais. It's been a number of years. She'echad hispoyer shemotza chilazon. That one guy got up and he glorified himself that he found the chilazon. Who's he talking about? Radziner Rebbe. V'asir meno Techeles, v'himshech acharav eze anoshim. And he got a few guys to put it on. So, did 12,000 people put it on? Maybe in Radzin. But for the most part, it was not accepted. It was not accepted. Now, the story doesn't end here, Rabbi Said. One of the most interesting parts of this episode is when the Radziner Rebbe bumped into none other than Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, the Beis HaLevi. And supposedly, one of the things the Beis HaLevi told him was the pasuk in this week's Parsha. The fact that it says, it says by the Lavan and not by the Techeles, that's a proof that Lavan is l'doiraisam and Techeles is not. However, this story is highly questionable, because this is not a halachic argument. You can't make a diuk from a pasuk to argue against a halacha. And therefore, what we want to know is, our adventure has not ended. What, in fact, did the Beis HaLevi tell the Radziner Rebbe? For more adventures with the Radziner Rebbe, stay tuned for next week, same time, Monday morning, Be'ezras Hashem Yisparach. Shkaya. That was long.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.